You've already met my co-host, David Otey. What you may not realize is that he has a very personal connection with today's topic. As you are about to find out, when you hear what he has to say, you will understand even more clearly why we call this event an Afternoon of Hope. David's speech is titled 6 Words. Please welcome back to the stage my co-host and our keynote speaker, David Otey. Thank you, David.
You've heard this afternoon from mental health professionals, from other medical professionals, from researchers. I am none of those things. I am a storyteller. Now, you've heard some powerful stories this afternoon. You've heard stories of loss. You've heard stories of hope. It's been a bit of a roller coaster. Even some of our mental health professionals have shared with us some of their own challenges. What you're about to hear from me is what those mental health professionals call lived experience. Now, you may not know this, but the phrase lived experience comes from a Latin phrase meaning he did not go to med school. That's right, no med school debt for me. But my therapist just bought a house in Aspen. Now, when I talk about my lived experience, that's not in any way meant to imply any comparison with your own experience, or that anything that worked for me will work for you. It's just my experience. What I do believe is that when you have experienced what you're about to hear, something will be different for you. Maybe you'll feel compelled to have that challenging conversation with someone you've been putting off, somebody close to you. Maybe you will be ready to have a conversation with a mental health professional. I hope you will feel emboldened to share your story with someone who needs to hear it. And maybe you will think, wow, I'm not alone. And that would be good too. So come with me on a little journey through time. Oh, if you are prone to claustrophobia, please ignore me for the next 3 minutes. Seriously, take out your phone, 2 games of Candy Crush, you should be good. Otherwise, imagine this. You are walking into a tunnel. Not a highway tunnel, not a carpal tunnel, not a tunnel that Wile E. Coyote painted on the side of a cliff, but a tunnel leading into an abandoned gold mine. As you move away from the entrance, the only light comes from a headlamp being worn by the person walking in front of you, because there's no room for the 2 of you to walk side by side. You can reach both hands out and touch the sides of this tunnel. If that feels like it's closing in, get your phone out. Candy Crush, I'm telling you. We'll pick you up later. You can smell the musty, damp air in this tunnel that's carved out of solid rock. But the only thing you can see is the outline of the person walking in front of you, silhouetted against the light of his headlamp reflecting off the tunnel walls. That's where I was. I was 12 years old. And the person walking in front of me was my dad. We were vacationing in northern New Mexico, and my dad had taken it upon himself to decide that it would be a good idea to explore one of the abandoned gold mines that dot the side of Wheeler Peak. And you might be wondering, well, David, why on earth would you follow him in there? When I was 12 years old, I would follow my dad a lot of places. He was the kind of guy who would walk into an abandoned gold mine, confident in the knowledge that the worst that would happen is he'd walk out with a new story. So yeah, I was following him. And then, all of a sudden, without any warning, I found myself in pitch darkness. No light at all, no familiar outline of my father's shape. When I reached out to touch him, he wasn't there. Where had he gone? Had he fallen down some hidden shaft? If I took one more step, would I do the same? I froze. I felt my heart pounding, my mouth going too dry to speak. I said to myself, David, there's no one here to help you. What are you going to do? I was paralyzed. And then, just as suddenly, I was blinded by the light. You just sang that in your head, didn't you? You can thank me for the earworm later. It'll be in your mind all week. I was blinded by the light of my father's headlamp. He had turned around to see why I wasn't following him. The tunnel had unexpectedly made a sharp right turn, and when he turned, there was nothing to reflect his light back at me. To this day, I have never experienced such utter physical darkness. My dad looked at me and said, "Why weren't you following me?" And I said, "You disappeared. You never told me that was a dad's superpower." And that pretty much brought an end to our subterranean adventure. Can you imagine not being able to take another step and not knowing where to turn? Feeling alone and powerless and paralyzed? Have you ever disappeared into the darkness? In the next few minutes, we're going to go through some dark places together. I can't promise you that you'll find gold at the end of our journey. My dad and I didn't find it either. But I can promise you this: you won't be alone. When we come to those unexpected dark corners, we'll navigate them together. And at the end, you will have something better than treasure. You'll have a message of hope, the kind of hope that illuminates those dark corners, the kind of hope that will help you light the way for someone else. So come back with me to 2001. George W. Bush was in the White House, Survivor was on TV, and I was in an office about 5 miles west of here. And something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't put a name on it. But I felt stuck. I felt just as immobilized as I was in that dark tunnel. More than stuck, though, I felt like a failure. I felt like I was a failure as an engineer, as a husband, as a father. I remember saying to myself, David, what value do you offer anyone? To this day, I have never experienced such utter psychological darkness. I was back in that mind tunnel, except that I had two things going for me. One was a telephone, and the other was the knowledge that I could ask for help. And I feel very fortunate for having grown up in a family where it's okay to ask for help. And I realize that's not true for everyone, especially us guys. When you picture a guy picking up the phone to ask for something, it's probably what?
Pizza.
Pizza. That's what I was going to say.
Power tools.
Power tools. We'll go with pizza. I mean, let's face it, for most guys, asking for help is right down there with asking for directions. Is it any wonder GPS was built on the work of a woman mathematician? There you go, ladies. One more century of pointing men in the right direction. But back to 2001. It was February. I remember clearly the day I was staring at that telephone, and I finally decided to pick it up. And I called the number for Arapahoe Douglas Mental Health, my county mental health agency. And not long after that, I found myself in the office of a therapist named Randy. And not long after that, I found myself in the office of a psychiatrist. And then I had my diagnosis: major depressive disorder. Disorder. In simpler terms, depression. Now, would you believe that there are people, probably not in this room, but you will encounter them, people who think that depression is not real? They put it in the same category as ghosts, UFOs, and honest roofers. Well, I'm here to tell you there are things in this life that are real and verifiable and true, whether you believe it or not. Vaccines save lives. The world is round. The Colorado Rockies once played in a World Series. I know, hard to believe. And depression is real. Now, let me remind you that I am not a mental health professional. I am not here to diagnose, to offer treatment, to make any recommendations. I'm just telling you my experience. And my experience was a diagnosis of depression and a doctor who said, David, we're going to put you on a medication that will help you get to the point where you can be an active participant in your recovery. So my recovery from depression involved medication, counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, prayer, journaling, and the loving support of my wife, Susan. And the last three of those were free. But you know, when I say I was depressed, that doesn't really begin to convey the depth, the poignancy of what I was going through. So I actually went back and took a look at one of my old journals from that period, because I wanted to see how I was capturing at that time, in my own words, what I was going through. Here is an unedited journal entry from June 2001, about 3 months into my recovery. I can't find the energy or motivation to do those things I've identified as needing to be done. I think of suicide only rarely, maybe 1 or 2 times a week. But I still can't eliminate those thoughts entirely. I feel guilt and shame over the way things are going at home and at work. Things that should excite me don't. The end of school, going camping this weekend, the possibility of traveling to see a customer. I recoil from all those things. I was at least happy that my problem had been identified and I was getting treatment, but now it seems I'm not improving anymore. P.S. I'm available for children's birthday parties. Just kidding. But did you hear the impatience in my voice? I was ready to be done with this 3 months in. It was like, we've got a diagnosis. We know what to call this thing. Now let's fix it. I would come to learn that depression has its own timeline. It would be about 2 years before I felt fully functional again. And in those 2 years, there were some scary moments. Imagine this. Imagine two men living a few miles apart in South Metro Denver. Two men leading oddly parallel lives. Both men in their early 40s, both married to teachers, both with good jobs in telecommunications, both with 3 kids and a house in the suburbs, one in Highlands Ranch, one in Centennial. And their lives never intersected until one dark day. And I do have to caution you, this is one of those turns where it gets very dark. Because that was the day that one of those men, who happened to be me, walked out and got his copy of the Denver Post. We used to have these things called newspapers, Google it. Brought it in, unfolded it, and read the story of the man in Highlands Ranch who the day before had died of suicide, tragically. And what was even more tragic and sadly more newsworthy was that before ending his own life, he had ended the lives of his wife and children. Have you ever read a news story that made you feel like you'd been kicked in the gut by a mule? I read that and it terrified me. It scared the you-know-what out of me because of one other little detail about those men's oddly parallel lives. You see, we'd both been in treatment for depression for about a month. Now, I've heard mental health professionals say that there is a very precarious time in recovery from severe depression that often happens about a month in, because someone who is severely depressed is likely to be experiencing what is sometimes clinically called suicidal ideation. Ideas of suicide. But when I say ideas, that's misleading. These are not fleeting notions. For some people, these ideas of suicide become all-consuming. You heard in my journal entry about my own thoughts of suicide, which fortunately did not get quite to that level, not to the level that is now referred to as living through suicidal intensity. Think about that phrase for a minute. Someone can be living through suicidal intensity. And yet, as you also heard in my journal entry, someone's experiencing severe depression can be paralyzed, unable to carry out almost any intentional action. In effect, you can have someone who is too depressed to kill themselves. Now, imagine what could happen if, in the course of recovery from depression, that paralysis begins to dissipate before that suicidal intensity releases its grip. What can happen is what happened that day in Highlands Ranch in April 2001. A suicide accompanied by additional loss of life. Now, I can't minimize that. That was a tragedy for that family, for their whole community, for everyone who knew them. But I can tell you, it was not the end of the story, because of one more little detail I read about in the Denver Post. And that was the mention of a small caliber rifle. Did you know that in the United States, 3 out of every 5 gun deaths are suicides? Empirical evidence shows that when a person is contemplating suicide, they will often act in a moment of brief but heightened vulnerability. Think about that phrase for a moment. Brief but heightened vulnerability. And if a gun is available in that moment, a suicide attempt is much more likely to be fatal. So I read that in the news story, and I knew that at that moment in my basement, wrapped in a blanket and tucked away in a corner where nobody would be likely to find it, there was a small caliber rifle. To be specific, a Ruger 22 caliber carbine that my father had bought me when I was a teenager for sports shooting. Yes, I grew up around guns. I was a 19-year-old summer camp riflery instructor. I had taught people firearm safety. And I knew there was no way I would ever use a gun with the intent to harm someone, neither me nor anyone else. But how did I know? How could I know that that gentleman in Highlands Ranch wouldn't have said the exact same thing right up to that moment of brief but heightened vulnerability? I decided I would not take that chance. I went down to the basement, I got that gun, I took it to a gun shop and sold it. One small step that might have made me and my family a little safer. So whatever we can say about the tragedy that befell that family in Highlands Ranch, it may also be true that it saved a life. Yes, there were some scary moments along the way. There were moments when I felt as immobilized as I was in that gold mine. And there were moments when, and fortunately, increasingly frequent moments over time, where I felt motivated to take action, like getting rid of that gun. Recovery from depression for me was not a linear path at all. In fact, you're probably wondering, well, David, how did you finally recover from depression? And I'm not sure I can give you a good answer. But I can tell you this, that to answer that question as best I can, we've got to introduce a new character into the story. John? We've got to introduce a new character into the story. Please direct your attention to the screen, and if you're at home, make sure your sound is up. John, can you see it in here? The young woman you saw dancing in that video, it's my daughter, Barbara. Have you ever seen a more physical embodiment of pure joy? I just love watching Barbara dance. I shot that video when my wife Susan and I visited her in Montana a few years ago. She took us to experience her favorite Saturday morning activity, which was something called Afrofusion dance. Every week they would meet and they had the live drummers and they would learn new dance moves and do those combinations for each other. And right there, you just heard three things about Montana you didn't expect to hear, right? Dance moves, live drummers, and something called Afrofusion. I love watching Barbara dance. It just lights up my soul. She has such a bright light to offer. And there was a time when that light flickered. You see, when Barbara was in high school, she was diagnosed with major clinical depression. What an inheritance, right? When you think about everything you could possibly want to pass along to your children, I'm betting that a lifelong mental disorder with possibly fatal complications is not high on your list. Well, Barbara went to work. We were so proud of her. She did the work. Her course of treatment for depression was similar to my own. It involved medication and therapy and talking to a psychiatrist and a psychologist and journaling and doing artwork, just trying to figure out how to express what was keeping her from living that joy-filled life that you saw she's capable of. My wife and I thought, she's got this. All through her senior year of high school, we thought, she's got this. She graduated. She went off to college in the fall, and we thought, what? She's got this. One thing you need to know about Barbara is that she is an empath. She tends to feel deeply any sorrow or negative emotion surrounding her. It's why we never let her watch Titanic. Raise your hand if you have a sensitive child. Okay. Well, imagine this. At the end of Barbara's junior year in college, she had a chance to go on a trip sponsored by a history professor from her school who taught the history of the Holocaust. Imagine your sensitive child going to a little town in France and reading about the Nazi atrocities that took place there. Imagine your sensitive child going to visit Schindler's factory. Imagine your sensitive child going on to visit sites of concentration camps. And then, just to throw in another wrinkle, imagine that your sensitive child was unable to pre-fill enough of her prescriptions to get her through the entire trip. We didn't know it at the time. We thought she was doing well. She came home that summer after the trip. She didn't seem quite as fine as she usually did, but we still thought she's doing the work. She's got this. She went off to her senior year in college, and we thought, she's got a counselor, she's staying busy, she's staying on top of her classes and her activities, she's doing well. On the Saturday of Halloween weekend, November 2nd, 2013, Susan and I were sitting at home enjoying a visit from a friend who had come over. The smell of homemade pizza lingered in the air, and we were laughing about some board game we'd been playing that our friend always lost. And Susan's phone rang. She looked at it. She said, "Oh, it's Barbara calling. Hi, sweetie." It was not our sweetie. A male voice on the other end said, "Reverend Otey," my wife is a minister now, "Reverend Otey, this is Barbara's friend Willard. I'm with her at the emergency room. She swallowed some pills. They're pumping her stomach. I think I got her here in time. I think she'll be okay." I believe what I said next was something like, "Thank God Willard called us. What I wanted to say was, "Okay? By what sick, twisted definition of that word can any of this possibly be okay?" That was Saturday night. Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, time for church. And my minister wife stands in front of her congregation at Grace United Methodist Church in Billings, Montana, and she led worship. She preached a sermon. She did her best to make a joyful noise to the Lord, as the psalmist says. And at the end of that service, she stood in front of her congregation, and I stood next to her, while she explained to these people who had known our bubbly, lively, outgoing middle daughter all through her high school years that she had tried to end her life. Have you ever experienced something you just can't make sense of? Well, that afternoon, Susan got on a plane to Michigan. I, on the other hand, went to a rehearsal for a play I was opening in the next weekend. A play called August, Osage County. A play about a family that comes apart over a family member's apparent suicide. Define irony. Well, by the end of that week, Barbara was released from the hospital, and Susan brought her home to spend the rest of the fall semester at home with us. She was doing the work, the counseling, the journaling, trying to come to grips with what had happened. It was quite some time after the event before Barbara was ready to say to her mom, "I tried to kill myself." And Susan said, "Yeah, we know." And it was even some time after that before I thought Barbara was ready to answer the question that was running through my mind. And I asked her, "Barbara, what was Willard doing there?" She said, "I called him." I said, "After you took the pills, you called Willard?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" "I didn't want to die alone." Six words. Those 6 words are forever engraved upon my heart. Imagine, here is someone experiencing a kind of pain, a level of emptiness that that I couldn't even fathom. And the people person in her couldn't stand the thought of being alone. But that's not where Barbara's story ends either. She did stay home with us the rest of that fall semester, doing the work, keeping up with her schoolwork as best she could. And come January, with some misgivings, we let her return to college for the spring semester. Oh, we had a plan in place. She had to stay in frequent contact with us. She had to continue talking to her counselor on campus. And she had to return our phone calls and our text messages promptly. Super annoying, I know. We had to know she was safe. By the grace of God, and with the help of that small academic community that lifted her up and supported her, Barbara graduated with her class that spring. Barbara's doing well now. You saw her dancing 5 years later. You know what Barbara's favorite expression is? You've heard it before. She's the one I got it from. She says, "Dad, you've got to feel all the feels." Feel all the feels. The ones that lift you up and the ones that threaten to pull you down. Because if you can't feel them, if you become numb to them, how can you be truly alive? As alive as that young woman you saw dancing. As alive as the young woman you're about to meet. You heard my version of her story. Now you get to hear hers. For the first time ever, it gives me great pleasure to invite her to join me on the speaking platform. Please welcome my daughter, Barbara Otey.
Take a deep breath, everyone. You know the story has a good ending. This November, it will have been 11 years since my near-fatal suicide attempt. It has taken me probably half of that time to get comfortable even calling it a suicide attempt. For a long time, I couldn't use those words to describe what had happened because I felt like it didn't accurately reflect what had happened. I was an RA in college, a resident advisor for 2.5 years, and in that position, I attended QPR gatekeeper training, which is a suicide prevention training. I did it twice. And in that training, I heard long lists, some of the things that we've heard here today, of signs to look out for. Depression, withdrawing into yourself, isolating. And at the time, I thought, well, those don't apply to me. Most people around me didn't know how much I was truly struggling with depression and anxiety. I was so good at masking it that my attempt came as a surprise to everyone who knew me. And one of my therapists later on said, "Barbara, yours was one of the scary ones. No one saw it coming." In the days and the weeks prior to my attempt, I didn't show any outward signs. I didn't immediately start giving away my possessions. I didn't talk about a plan. I didn't, write letters to loved ones or immediately seem happier with an end in sight. Instead, I went through my daily routine. I went to class. I did my research for my senior thesis. I applied to PT schools. I went to my practicum. I met with friends. I did my RA duties. I stayed so busy, sun up to well past sundown, so that I would never have to stop and think about the anxiety, the constant barrage of voices that were telling me I was not good enough, that it didn't matter what I did, it would never be enough. And so I sat in this void, and no one saw how much I was struggling. No one saw how much I just needed to hear, "You are worth more than your degree. You are worth it even if you don't go to PT school. Your life is more important than this list of your accomplishments." And so I sat in this void where a lack of emotion was more terrifying than the onslaught of all the emotions. A void where I felt like the life that I was living wasn't a life at all. And so on November 2nd, 2013, I tried to fill that void. It was not something that I had planned. It was not premeditated. In fact, I had gone through some of the mitigation strategies. I had turned over my antidepressants to my therapist. I had to check into the counseling center every day to get them. I had given my crafting scissors, my X-Acto blades, and my car keys over to my best friend Emily. We had dumped my alcohol. I got rid of the lethal means. I lived in a very flat state, so there were no tall buildings. So that was like not even a thing that I had to consider. The only thing I had was my prescription beta blockers if my heart rate got too high. So no, it was not planned. There was not a note that I left behind. There was no concept of what would happen, how it would affect the people around me. There was just a void, an emptiness that I thought I could fill by swallowing a bottle of beta blockers. It turns out the void doesn't need to be filled. The void needs to be acknowledged. That's what this artwork is showing. Years later, I was talking to one of my therapists about my attempt, and she says, "Barbara, I notice you don't call it a suicide attempt. Why is that?" Because suicide is something that happened to other people, not to me. Because I had dissociated from my attempt. Because I could tell the story as if it happened to someone else. Or because doing so meant admitting to my own lethality, that I had tried to kill someone, me. Calling it a suicide attempt meant owning up to that lethality inside of me. And admitting that was so, and is so, antithetical to my role as an early childhood educator. I am a caregiver of these young, tiny humans who are the ultimate embodiment of life. And there was such a cognitive dissonance there, I couldn't reconcile it with who I knew myself to be. I couldn't own my story because I couldn't own up to that darkness inside of me. So why don't we talk about suicide? Because it requires us to face up to our own mortality, the uncertainty and the unknown, and to consider, even hypothetically, a world without you or me in it. And that's terrifying. And owning up to suicidal ideations, ideas, even without a plan, is even more terrifying because it means owning up to the fact that you want to kill someone. When I finally admitted my own suicidal ideations to my therapist in college, Jen, I remember distinctly seeing her eyes fill with tears. And she swallowed them down. She talked me through my safety plan. She put her own big feelings to the side so that she could validate mine without judgment or fear or shame. Jen faced the void with me. She did not shy away from the darkness. And eventually, after years of medication, therapy, EMDR, the loving support of my family and my friends, I learned not to be afraid of it either. It was years later, in my role as an early childhood educator, that I finally reached that point of acceptance. The duality of light and dark that exists in all of us. It was nap time, and I was laying next to this little 3-year-old who didn't like to nap. I had tried all of my usual tricks. I sat next to her, I modeled deep breathing. I rubbed her back, I stroked her hair, I held her little hand, nothing. Finally, I just gave up and I laid there next to her and I thought, well, she'll either sleep or she won't, but at least she's quiet. I was still holding her little hand, and all of a sudden, I felt her little fingers like tickling up my arm. Kids are such sensory seekers, you know? And she brushed her little fingers over this arm where I just have the faintest self-harm scars from college. She brushed her fingers over them, and then she whispered in her little toddler voice, "You got owies?" Then she kissed the self-harm scars, and she smiled at me, and she said, "There, you all better now." I know, right? She didn't ask how I got them. She didn't see this depressed version of me. She didn't see my lethality or my attempt. She just saw me, Miss Barbara. The children in my care love me and accept me unconditionally, even when I'm grumpy or impatient or I have to use my big teacher voice with them, which, happens a lot. I help them regulate their big feelings, and more importantly, they help me regulate mine. I saw that I was good enough for them, and I learned to see and believe that I was good enough for myself, too.
Got to feel all the feels. Feeling some big feels. Feeling a lot of pride, a lot of love, and a lot of, as a speaker, envy over the connection you obviously had with this audience. And I had to come back because I never answered that question I posed earlier. How did you recover from depression? And I needed you to see how intertwined our stories are. After Barbara was doing better, I was having a conversation with Susan, and I remember saying, well, watching what Barbara is going through is holding up a mirror to my own experience. And that mirror is saying, David, you've been complacent. You need to get real about taking care of your mental health. And Susan said, you listen to that mirror more than you listen to me. Raise your hand if you think sometimes facing reality can be hard. Well, I was not facing reality. I hadn't been ever since a moment about 10 years earlier when I decided I was done with depression. Yeah, I thought of my recovery as a one and done, kind of like Devo. Google it. What Barbara helped me see is that my recovery will be a lifelong process. I'll have to continue monitoring my moods and my thought processes and my coping mechanisms, as I'm sure Barbara does, just as surely as a friend of mine has to monitor his blood sugar. It's a lifelong process. So, instead of asking the question, David, how did you finally recover from depression? Maybe a better question to ask is, David, when did you recover from depression? And the answer is, today. And with God's help, tomorrow and the day after. Deep breath time again. It's been quite a day, speaking of days, right? I think it's time for a little check-in. Here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to find somebody nearby to talk to. If you're at home on Zoom, I hope there is someone nearby you can talk to, because we're not going to do breakout rooms. If you're in a room, turn to someone nearby, even if it's someone you don't know. And what I would like you to do is turn to someone, look at them, and say, how are you really doing today? And your job is to listen closely enough to their answer to know whether maybe you need to continue that conversation after we're done in a few minutes. I'm going to give you 1 minute, that's 30 seconds each for you to answer the question. Go. Raise your hand if you just started a conversation that you're going to continue in a few minutes after we're done. Oh, that's great. That is great. We've been feeling some big feels this afternoon, haven't we? Yeah, you've heard from mental health professionals. You've heard some stories of pain. You've heard stories of loss. You've heard stories of near loss. And you've vicariously experienced the joy that Barbara expresses through dance. There's one more thing you need to do in order to go out and shine a light for someone else, to help them find that treasure. Raise your hand if in the last little while you have felt something. Yeah. Why do you think that is? What made you feel something? Stories. Stories have power. Power to move people. And we're not the only ones with powerful stories. You have them too. Stories of your own journey through life's ups and downs. Those stories can teach and illuminate and inspire. Those stories can shine a light in a dark corner for you, for someone else. Will you be the one to share your story? Maya Angelou said, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. So here's my challenge to you. Be vulnerable enough to share your untold story. And when you do, you keep the conversation alive. And when you keep the conversation alive, you keep hope alive. And when you keep hope alive, I'll let you finish the rest.